The morning light of September 23, 1863, crept through the Canterbury studio windows like honey through muslin, illuminating countless motes of dust that danced above the chemical trays. Thomas Whitmore bent over his workbench, his practiced hands coating a glass plate with collodion, that peculiar marriage of gun-cotton and ether that made modern miracles possible. The smell, sweet and sharp, had long since ceased to trouble him, though visitors often covered their noses upon entering his domain. Listen now to the small sounds of mastery, the gentle swirl of amber liquid across pristine glass, the soft exhalation of held breath as the coating spread to perfect evenness. Here was a man who understood that photography was equal parts chemistry and prayer, that every plate prepared was a gamble against time and trembling hands. His fingernails, permanently stained with silver nitrate, marked him as surely as any guild sign might have marked a medieval craftsman. "Blast and bother!" The cry came from the front room, followed by an expensive tinkle of breaking glass. Sam Pickering, 19 years of earnest enthusiasm and clumsy elbows, appeared in the doorway with fragments of a lens cradled in his palms like a broken bird. Thomas straightened slowly, his back protesting the movement. 34 years sat upon his shoulders like a well-worn coat, comfortable but showing signs of weather. "The Dollmeyer?" he asked, though the answer glittered in Sam's guilty hands. "I'll work extra hours, Mr. Whitmore. Sundays, too, I swear it." The boy's wages wouldn't cover a tenth of the lens's cost, and they both knew it. Thomas thought of his sister Dorothy, of the 3 shillings he'd promised her this week for coal, of the way her youngest coughed in the damp. He thought, too, of Sam's evening walks past the baker's shop, not for the bread, but for glimpses of the flour-dusted daughter who worked the counter. "We'll manage," he said, returning to his collodion, "though you'll practice with the old equipment until Christmas." The morning post arrived with unusual ceremony, brought not by the regular boy, but by a liveried footman who seemed personally offended by the chemical odors. The letter bore the weight of good paper and better breeding, sealed with red wax pressed deep with an elaborate coat of arms. Thomas read it twice, his eyebrows climbing higher with each pass. Lord Edmund Blackwood, Member of Parliament and owner of Thornfield Hall near Maidstone, requested the pleasure of Mr. Whitmore's professional attendance for a series of stereoscopic portraits. The new fashion for 3-dimensional photographs had reached even the landed gentry, it seemed, those arbiters of taste, who adopted innovation only after the middle classes had thoroughly tested it for respectability. "A lord wants your services." Sam peered over his shoulder, forgetting his recent catastrophe in the excitement of aristocratic proximity. The fee mentioned would cover the studio rent for 3 months, with enough left over to replace the broken lens and still send Dorothy something substantial. Yet Thomas felt that familiar twist of caution in his gut, the working man's instinctive wariness of entering grand houses where different rules applied, where a single misstep could ruin more than just a photograph. He set the letter aside and returned to his plates, but his mind wandered to stereoscopy itself, that peculiar magic of twin images that fooled the eye into seeing depth where none existed. 2 slightly different views merged in the brain to create the illusion of dimension. Was this not, he wondered, how we all moved through life? One eye seeing what was, the other what might be, the truth somewhere in the convergence. The creditor arrived just after noon, a Mr. Maple whose demeanor suggested his name was the only sweet thing about him. 3 weeks late, Whitmore. My patience wears thin as your excuses. By month's end, Thomas promised, the Blackwood letter practically burning in his pocket. You have my word. Your word doesn't pay my bills. Though your photographs might. My wife admires that portrait you did of the mayor's family. Perhaps an arrangement? They negotiated while Sam attempted to salvage something from the broken lens, grinding the intact portions into smaller elements that might serve some future purpose. The boy had good instincts about waste, understood that in their profession everything could be repurposed, even failure. Evening drums out into Canterbury's streets, his slight limp more pronounced after the day's standing. The old injury from falling through his father's workshop floor at age 12 had left him with a peculiar rolling gait that Sam had once described, in an unguarded moment, as distinguished, like a seafaring gentleman. Thomas preferred to think of it as a reminder that solid ground was always an illusion, that every step required faith in what appeared firm. The cathedral bells tolled 6 o'clock as he passed the shuttered shops, their windows reflecting the gas lamps in wavering pools of yellow light. Through one uncurtained window, he glimpsed a family at dinner, their faces warm in the candle glow, and felt that peculiar ache of the permanent observer, always outside the frame he captured. The railway carriage rocked with metronomic persistence as Thomas watched Kent's hopfields blur past the window, their tall poles standing like regiments of green soldiers in the September 25th morning mist. Sam sat opposite, clutching the equipment cases with the devotion of a mother hen, having learned his lesson about the fragility of their trade. The stereoscopic camera, that double-eyed marvel of brass and mahogany, occupied its own seat like a paying passenger, wrapped in velvet against the journey's jolts. Consider the peculiar democracy of railway travel, where a photographer might share a compartment with a banker, where speed compressed not just distance, but social distinction. Yet Thomas knew better than to mistake proximity for equality. The banker reading his Times would forget Thomas's face before reaching his destination, while Thomas would remember the man's gold watch chain, the way he unconsciously checked it every few minutes, as if time might escape when unobserved. Grand, isn't it? Sam pressed his nose to the glass as Thornfield Hall emerged from its envelope of elm trees. The Georgian manor sprawled across the landscape with the confidence of centuries, its limestone facade glowing amber in the afternoon light. The approach revealed layers of prosperity. The gravel drive raked to mathematical precision, topiary spheres standing sentinel along the terraces, windows that gleamed like watching eyes. Thomas counted them automatically, calculating exposure times and angles, already composing frames in his mind. This was how he entered any space now, not as a guest, but as a chronicler, measuring light and shadow before noticing the furniture. Lord Blackwood received them in his study, a room that announced its owner's interests as clearly as any calling card. Modern innovations crowded against ancient privileges. An electric bell system beside medieval manuscripts. A telescope pointed not at heaven, but at tenant farms. Photographs of railway ceremonies neighboring portraits of bewigged ancestors. Whitmore, capital! His lordship's handshake conveyed both welcome and evaluation. Heard excellent things about your work from Colonel Morrison. Says you made his wife look almost pleasant. The laugh that followed expected accompaniment, which Thomas provided with practiced ease. 52 years had treated Lord Blackwood kindly, leaving him with the robust complexion of a man who breakfasted on beefsteak and certainty. Yet Thomas noticed the slight tremor in his left hand, quickly hidden by clasping both behind his back, and the way his eyes never quite settled, always scanning, assessing, calculating political angles, even in his own drawing room. Lady Margaret appeared for tea, 46 years arranged in dove-gray silk, her movements careful, as if she navigated invisible obstacles. "Mr. Whitmore, how thrilling to have a genuine artist among us. We're quite behind the times here, I'm afraid." Her voice carried that particular tone of the upper classes, deprecating their own advantages while simultaneously emphasizing them. The tea service alone could have paid Thomas's rent for a year. Yet she apologized for the china pattern being dreadfully out of fashion. Miss Constance Blackwood entered with the studied grace of a young woman prepared for inspection. 23 years of accomplished femininity. Her engagement ring caught the light aggressively, a diamond that seemed to shout its presence.
"Father says you'll make us appear three-dimensional. Aren't we already?"
The question carried more philosophy than perhaps she intended, and Thomas found himself genuinely smiling. "We are, Miss Blackwood, but the camera typically forgets this truth. Stereoscopy helps it remember." Young Mr. Reginald Blackwood arrived last, sun-darkened from his Indian service, moving with the restless energy of a man still adjusting to English drawing rooms after colonial verandas. At 21, he wore his military bearing like an ill-fitting coat, too rigid for civilian life. "Photography, eh? Useful in mapping. We employed it extensively in the Punjab." His tone suggested everything could be measured by its military application. Dinner revealed the family's careful choreography, each member playing their role with practiced precision. Yet Thomas noticed the spaces between words, the glances that didn't quite connect, the way Lady Margaret startled when footsteps sounded overhead. "Old houses," Lord Blackwood said quickly. "Settling wood. Happens constantly." But Thomas had grown up in a house of similar age, knew the difference between settling timber and human weight on floorboards. Sam caught his eye, having heard it too, but wisely concentrated on his soup. "I sometimes hear them at night," Constance mentioned, earning a sharp look from her mother. "Rather romantic, really. Like having ghosts." "Nonsense," her father declared, though his voice carried more force than the comment warranted. "Tomorrow, Mr. Whitmore, we'll begin in the morning room. The light there is particularly fine." They assigned Thomas quarters in the West Wing, a guest room that spoke of faded grandeur, wallpaper roses blooming eternally in Brussels patterns. Sam would sleep with the servants, an arrangement that clearly pleased him, closer to kitchen gossip and farther from the family's scrutiny. Setting up the stereoscopic camera in the morning room required the precision of a military campaign. The double lenses needed exact calibration, the distance between them mimicking human eyes, that 2.5-inch span that separated flat documentation from dimensional truth. "Why does it need two?" Constance asked, genuinely curious as she watched him work. "Because that's how we see, Miss Blackwood. Each eye captures a slightly different view. The magic happens when our mind combines them." He adjusted the brass fittings with unconscious expertise. "Photography usually gives us the world as a cyclops would see it. This shows it as we do." The converted pantry reeked of chemistry and ambition as Thomas worked in the amber darkness, developing the plates from the morning's portrait session. September 26th had dawned crisp and clear, perfect for photography. Yet now, in this makeshift darkroom, he found himself questioning the evidence before his eyes. The family portraits emerged as expected. Lord Blackwood's authority captured in silver salts. Lady Margaret's nervousness frozen in perpetual composure. But the drawing room plates told a different story entirely. Watch him now, bending close to the glass, his breath held to avoid disturbing the chemical bath. There, in the third plate, near the sealed door to the east wing, hung a shape that shouldn't exist. Not quite a figure, not quite a shadow, but something between states, like smoke given human form. The stereoscopic effect made it worse, gave the apparition depth, made it occupy space in that frozen moment. Sam peered over his shoulder, his usual chatter stilled by the peculiarity. "Chemical flaw?" he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Thomas had been developing plates for 15 years, knew every way collodion could betray an image, dust motes that became stars, fingerprints that created galaxies, bubbles that opened windows to nowhere. This was none of those. The figure possessed intentionality, stood rather than floated, existed rather than merely appeared. "Perhaps a double exposure," Thomas murmured, though he knew his own methodical nature made such an error unlikely. Each plate was numbered, catalogued, tracked with the devotion of a banker counting gold. Still, he examined his notebook, confirmed what memory already knew. Plate number 7, drawing room, eastern wall, 8-minute exposure, commenced at 11:43 in the morning. He developed the remaining plates with increasing unease. The figure appeared in 3 of the 12 drawing room images, always in the same area, always with that peculiar quality of being almost but not quite there. In the stereoscopic pairs, when viewed through the proper apparatus, it seemed to stand behind the furniture, a resident of that three-dimensional illusion the camera had created. The afternoon brought new sessions. The library this time, its leather-bound volumes providing a suitably scholarly backdrop for Reginald's portrait. The young man posed with studied casualness, one hand on a globe, as if he might spin the world at whim. "In India," he mentioned, apropos of nothing, "the natives believe photographs steal souls. Primitive superstition, of course." Yet Thomas wondered if perhaps they understood something the civilized world had forgotten, that images did take something from their subjects, captured more than light and shadow. What else might a camera record, given sufficient sensitivity and time? Butler Jameson appeared with tea, moving through the house with the fluid invisibility of the longtime servant. 60 years had taught him to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to exist in rooms without occupying them. Thomas recognized a fellow professional, someone who had mastered their craft so thoroughly it appeared effortless. "Mr. Jameson," Thomas ventured during a break, "this house must have quite a history." The butler's face revealed nothing. A professional mask perfected over decades. "Indeed, sir. The Blackwood family has resided here since 1792. Any interesting stories? For context, you understand. It helps to know the space I'm photographing." Jameson paused, perhaps weighing loyalty against the harmless curiosity of a tradesman. "Every old house has its stories, Mr. Whitmore. Some are told, others are remembered differently." The peculiar phrasing lingered as Thomas returned to his work. That evening, while adjusting equipment in the drawing room, he studied the sealed door more carefully. The paint was fresher than the surrounding woodwork, perhaps 5 years old rather than 50. The keyhole had been filled with putty, painted over, made deliberately unusable. "Structural damage," Lord Blackwood said from behind him, causing Thomas to start. How long had his lordship been watching? "Water damage from the old days. We sealed it off rather than repair it. More economical." But Thomas knew water damage, had photographed enough crumbling mansions to recognize its patterns. This door bore no water stains, showed no warping. It had been sealed for other reasons, human reasons, the kind that required forgetting rather than repair. That night, unable to sleep, he walked the grounds under a harvest moon that turned the gardens silver. The east wing loomed dark against the stars, its windows blackened, curtains drawn. Yet once he could have sworn he saw movement, a figure passing behind the heavy drapes. When he looked again, stillness had returned, leaving him to wonder if imagination had begun contaminating observation. Sam found him in the morning, already preparing plates for the day's work. "You look troubled, Mr. Whitmore." "Simply considering the technical challenges," Thomas replied, though they both knew he lied.
The boy had learned to read his moods the way Thomas read light, understanding when to press and when to allow silence its sovereignty. "My gran used to say, houses remember everything that happens in them," Sam offered, mixing chemicals with practiced ease. "Said that's why some places feel happy and others don't, no matter how much money gets spent on them." Thomas thought of his father's workshop, how it still smelled of clock oil and disappointment 20 years after the old man's death. Perhaps Sam's grandmother understood something about the persistence of memory that science hadn't yet catalogued. Or perhaps every surface was like a photographic plate, waiting for the right conditions to reveal what it had witnessed, requiring only the proper chemistry to develop its secrets. September 27th arrived, wrapped in morning fog that clung to Thornfield Hall like a guilty secret. Thomas positioned his stereoscopic camera at new angles in the drawing room, determined to either prove or dispel the peculiarity of yesterday's plates. If the figure appeared again, consistent in its inconsistency, then either the room itself was flawed or something more deliberate was occurring. See him now, marking positions on the floor with chalk, creating a geometry of observation that would leave no corner unexamined. Sam assisted with tape measures and notebooks, recording each camera placement with the precision of a surveyor. They had become cartographers of the invisible, mapping not land but light, not territory but time. 8 minutes again? Sam asked, checking the pocket watch they used for exposures. Thomas nodded, though privately he wondered if longer might reveal more. In photography, time was the third chemical, after silver and light. Given enough of it, even the faintest presence might inscribe itself on glass. Lord Blackwood entered during the third exposure, his impatience manifesting in the aggressive way he consulted his own timepiece. "Surely by now you have sufficient images, Whitmore. My wife is anxious to see results." "The stereoscopic process requires precision, my lord. Each pair must match perfectly, or the illusion of depth fails." Thomas kept his voice level, deferential without being servile. "Your drawing room presents particular challenges with its varied light sources." His lordship grunted but didn't press. Politicians, Thomas had observed, understood delay when framed as perfectionism. They employed it often enough themselves. The figure appeared in the fifth plate, clearer this time, definitely feminine in shape, positioned near that perpetually sealed door. More disturbing, it had moved between exposures, occupied different coordinates in his careful grid. This was no fixed flaw in the room or equipment, but something ambulatory, something that existed in time as well as space. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Cornelius Ashford arrived with his medical bag, though no one had mentioned illness. 58 years of provincial practice had given him the bearing of a man who had seen too much and spoken of too little. Thomas observed him from the library window, watched as he directed his driver to the servants' entrance rather than the main door. "The family physician," Jameson explained when asked, though his tone suggested this information should suffice. "He attends twice weekly." But Thomas had photographed enough wealthy families to know their doctors arrived with fanfare at the front door, their visits social as much as medical. This furtive arrival spoke of different needs, the kind that required discretion rather than display. During the afternoon session, while photographing Constance in the morning room, Thomas noticed fresh flowers placed at the unused fireplace in the east corner. Not the usual arrangement for show, but simple wildflowers, the kind a child might gather. When he approached to adjust his equipment, Constance spoke quickly. "Please don't disturb those. Mother insists they remain exactly there." "They're lovely, very natural compared to the formal arrangements." Constance glanced toward the door, ensuring they were alone. "Mother has her peculiarities. We all do, I suppose. When I marry, I wonder what peculiarities I'll develop, what flowers I'll place for reasons I can't explain to servants." Her frankness surprised him. Young ladies of her class rarely spoke so directly to tradesmen. Perhaps the camera created a confessional space, its mechanical eye less judgmental than human ones. "Everyone has their rituals, Miss Blackwood." Photography has taught me that what people choose to display often matters less than what they try to hide. She studied him with unexpected intensity. "And what do you see us hiding, Mr. Whitmore?" Before he could form a diplomatic answer, Lady Margaret entered, her presence immediately shifting the room's emotional temperature. "Constance, you're needed upstairs. Your fitting has arrived." The young woman left with visible reluctance, and Lady Margaret took her place before the camera. "My daughter speaks too freely sometimes. The wedding preparations have her overwrought." Thomas adjusted his lenses, saying nothing. He had learned that silence often prompted more revelation than questions. Lady Margaret fidgeted, unusual for someone of her breeding, trained from birth to hold poses for portraits. "This house," she said suddenly, "requires certain accommodations. Every family has its difficulties. Surely you understand, Mr. Whitmore." "You're a man of the world." He wasn't, particularly, but he recognized a plea when he heard one. "I understand discretion, Lady Margaret. My profession depends upon it." Relief flickered across her features before propriety reasserted itself. The exposure continued in silence, 8 minutes of held breath and controlled anxiety, while somewhere above them, footsteps crossed a floor that should have been empty. That evening, while Sam cleaned equipment, Thomas walked the grounds again, this time studying the East Wing's architecture. The windows were not just curtained, but shuttered from within, some showing signs of recent repair. A delivery man's path, worn but discreet, led to a side entrance he hadn't previously noticed. Kitchen smoke drew him toward the servants' quarters, where cooking smells promised the comfort of ordinary life. Through an open window, he heard fragments of conversation, staff preparing the evening meal. "Poor soul barely touched yesterday's tray," a woman's voice lamented. "You know how she gets during the autumn," another replied. "Remembers too much when the leaves fall."
The conversation ceased abruptly when someone noticed his shadow passing. Servants, like photographers, understood the value of controlled exposure, knew when to develop revelations and when to keep them in darkness. The gallery stretched before Thomas like a tunnel through time. Portraits spanning 2 centuries of Blackwood prosperity, watching his progress with painted eyes. September 28th had brought rain, the kind that turned windows into flowing mirrors and made interior photography a matter of patience and artificial light. He positioned oil lamps strategically, their golden glow warming the ancestral faces that seemed to judge his intrusion.
Listen to the house speaking in raindrops against glass, in the creak of old wood accepting moisture, in the whisper of his footsteps on Persian runners worn thin by generations of passage. Sam worked beside him, adjusting reflectors fashioned from stretched muslin, redirecting light like a theatrical stagehand creating illusion from necessity. "That one's given me the shivers," Sam muttered, indicating a portrait of a woman in 1840s fashion, her dark hair severely parted, her expression containing a sadness that the artist had perhaps captured too well. Thomas studied the painting more carefully. The brass nameplate read, "Lady Catherine Blackwood, 1821 to 1848. But something about the composition seemed wrong. The background showed signs of alteration, another figure painted out with less skill than the original artist possessed. A ghostly shoulder remained visible at the canvas edge, someone who had stood beside Lady Catherine before being deemed unworthy of preservation. "Bring the magnifying glass," Thomas instructed, though even without it he could see the pentimento, that phenomenon where old paint revealed its secrets through transparency and time. The erased figure had been another woman, similar in features, perhaps a sister. The library adjoined the gallery, its shelves reaching toward a ceiling lost in shadow. Lord Blackwood had requested several stereoscopic views here, wanting to capture what he called the weight of knowledge. Thomas wondered if knowledge did have weight, if that's why learned men walked slowly, burdened by understanding. While Sam prepared plates in their makeshift darkroom, Thomas examined the family histories shelved between Milton and Marlowe. The Blackwood genealogy, bound in Morocco leather, revealed careful documentation until 1848, then grew vague. Lord Edmund had a sister, Helena, born 1814, but her entry ended abruptly with no death date, no marriage recorded, simply a blank where life should have continued. Finding us interesting reading? Reginald stood in the doorway, his approach silent as rainfall. Thomas closed the volume carefully. Architecture often makes more sense when you understand the families who built it. The young man's smile contained no warmth. Some understanding is better left uncultivated, wouldn't you agree? Like photographs, too much exposure ruins everything. After Reginald departed, Thomas photographed the library with particular attention to the genealogy section, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps because absence sometimes told clearer stories than presence, like the negative spaces in photographs that defined the positive. The kitchen provided refuge during the midday break. Cook, a Yorkshire woman whose accent could have curdled cream, ruled her domain with benevolent tyranny. She fed Sam enormous quantities of beef and pudding, while eyeing Thomas with a suspicion reserved for men who didn't eat enough. "You're too thin," she declared, loading his plate despite protests. "No wonder you see ghosts. Not enough meat on your bones to keep them out." The scullery maid giggled, then caught herself. "She didn't mean nothing by it, sir." But Thomas leaned forward, interested. "People see ghosts here?" Cook shot the girl a look that could have frozen July. "People see what they want to see, and don't see what they shouldn't. That's the way in all good houses." Yet later, while Thomas waited for plates to develop, the same scullery maid found him alone. "My mum worked here in the 40s, she whispered. "Said there were 2 Lady Blackwoods then, sisters by marriage. One died in childbirth, the other—" she glanced around nervously. "The other went peculiar after." They say she never left her room again, but Mum swore she heard her walking at night, looking for her sister. That evening's stereoscopic viewing session revealed the accumulated week's work to the family. Thomas had selected the clearest portraits, the most flattering angles, carefully excluding any plates showing the mysterious figure. Through the stereoscopic viewer, the Blackwoods saw themselves in 3 dimensions, exclaiming at the novelty of depth. "It's like looking through a window at ourselves," Constance marveled. "How peculiar to see oneself as others do." Lady Margaret examined her own portrait with less enthusiasm. "The accuracy is rather merciless, isn't it? Every line, every shadow preserved." "That's the democracy of photography," Thomas replied. "It treats everyone equally, records what is rather than what we wish." Lord Blackwood studied the drawing-room views with particular intensity. "These are acceptable, Whitmore, quite acceptable. Though I notice you've taken many angles of the same rooms, surely not all necessary." "Stereoscopy requires options, my lord. Not every angle produces the desired dimensional effect." He kept his voice neutral, professional, though he noticed how Lord Blackwood's attention lingered on the area near the sealed door, searching perhaps for something he feared to find. Near midnight, unable to sleep, Thomas heard it clearly. Footsteps above his room, in what should have been the empty east wing. Not the random creaking of old wood, but deliberate movement, pacing with the rhythm of troubled thought. He lay still, counting the steps, noting their pattern. 12 steps east, pause. 12 steps west, pause, repeat. Someone was walking a cage of their own making, measuring confinement in footfalls. September 29th dawned with the kind of crystalline light that photographers dream about. Yet Thomas found himself deliberately wasting it. He extended his exposure times to 12 minutes, then 15, claiming the need for exceptional depth in the stereoscopic effect. Sam watched him with growing puzzlement, but maintained the conspiracy of silence that apprentices learn early. Observe how Thomas positioned his camera now, angled to capture not just the drawing room, but the sealed door's entire frame, the walls around it, the ceiling above, where footsteps traced their nightly passages. He had become a hunter of the invisible, using time as his trap, patience as his weapon. During the 4th exposure, it happened. A distinct sound from behind the sealed door, not footsteps, but the whisper of fabric against wood, as if someone leaned against the barrier from the other side. Lord Blackwood was in London, Lady Margaret visiting neighbors, the younger generation riding. The servants were occupied with laundry, their voices carrying from the yard. Thomas held his breath, watching the sealed door while the camera's twin eyes gathered light and, perhaps, more. 17 minutes, Sam whispered, checking his watch. The plate will overexpose. But Thomas waited, some instinct keeping him frozen as surely as his subjects. Then, impossibly, the doorknob on the sealed door turned. Not completely, just a fractional rotation, enough to show that someone on the other side was testing, hoping, finding, as always, that escape remained denied. When the exposure finally ended, Thomas's hands shook as he removed the plate. In the dark room, the image emerged like a confession under torture. The figure was clearer than ever. A woman in middle age, her dress 2 decades out of fashion, her face turned toward the door she couldn't open. The stereoscopic effect, when viewed properly, placed her firmly in 3-dimensional space. No ghost, but a person caught in the amber of extended time.
"Mary, Mother of God," Sam breathed, his Yorkshire skepticism crumbling before evidence. "She's real." Thomas said nothing, developing the plate with extra care, ensuring every detail remained sharp. The woman's features bore unmistakable resemblance to the painted-over figure in the gallery portrait, to Lord Blackwood's bone structure softened by femininity and sorrow. Jameson found them as they emerged from the darkroom, his butler's radar having detected disturbance in the household routine. "Mr. Whitmore, you seem troubled. Perhaps some tea?" It was phrased as concern, but felt like warning. Thomas met the older man's eyes, seeing there a weight of knowledge carefully managed, loyalties balanced like china cups on a swaying tray. "Mr. Jameson, that sealed door in the drawing room, when exactly was it closed off?" The butler's face revealed nothing, that professional blankness perfected over decades. "I couldn't say precisely, sir." "Before my time, certainly." "You've been here 30 years. Surely you know the house's history?" Jameson glanced toward the main stairs, ensuring privacy. When he spoke, his voice had shed some of its formal armor. "Mr. Whitmore, you seem a decent man. You have employment elsewhere, a life to return to. Some doors are sealed for good reason. Some rooms are better left unvisited." "And some people?" Thomas pressed. The butler's composure cracked minutely. "Especially people, sir. Especially those who cannot help themselves." Before Thomas could respond, Jameson had retreated into his professional distance, leaving only the echo of warning in the air. Yet that afternoon, while photographing the conservatory, Thomas noticed the butler leaving a tray outside a servant's door he hadn't previously observed. The tray bore covered dishes, enough food for one person, arranged with unexpected care on china too fine for servants' use. The confrontation with Lord Blackwood came at dinner, inevitable as sunset. His lordship had returned from London early, mud on his boots, suggesting haste, his manner suggesting he'd received reports of Thomas's investigations. "Your work progresses slowly, Whitmore. Most photographers would have completed such a commission by now." "Stereoscopy requires precision, my lord. I want to ensure you receive the finest possible results." Lord Blackwood's knife scraped against his plate with unnecessary force. "Sometimes, Mr. Whitmore, the finest results come from knowing when to stop looking, when to accept that what we see is sufficient." The threat was genteel but unmistakable. Thomas thought of his sister, of Sam's future, of the rent waiting in Canterbury. He thought too of the woman behind the sealed door, pacing her prison in slippers that made no sound except to cameras that watched too long. "I understand, my lord." "Perhaps 2 more days would suffice to complete the commission." Relief flickered in Lord Blackwood's eyes. 2 days, yes, that would be acceptable.
That night, Thomas couldn't stop himself. While the house slept, he crept toward the east wing, following the servants' passages he'd mapped during his wanderings. The corridor was narrow, meant for invisible movement, lit only by his single candle. He found the door where Jameson had left the tray, now empty, returned with the same quiet care. He pressed his ear against the wood, heard nothing at first, then the soft sound of humming. A melody from decades past, the kind nurses sang to children, the kind that spoke of comfort in confinement. His hand found the doorknob, turned it slowly, locked of course. But the humming stopped, replaced by breathing on the other side, someone listening just as intently as he was. "Helena," he whispered, the name from the genealogy barely audible. The breathing quickened. Then, so soft he might have imagined it. Who remembers? September 30th arrived with Thomas performing an elaborate pantomime of mechanical failure. He scattered camera parts across the morning room table, consulting his watch with theatrical frustration, while Sam played along, fetching tools that weren't needed for repairs that weren't required. The performance convinced Lord Blackwood to leave for his afternoon appointments, muttering about the unreliability of modern contraptions. Watch how deception requires its own choreography, each false gesture calculated to seem natural. Thomas had learned this from photography itself, where posed spontaneity fooled viewers into believing they witnessed unguarded moments. Now he used the same principle in reverse, creating the illusion of incompetence to buy time for truth. Dr. Ashford arrived for his regular visit at 3 o'clock, medical bag in hand, weariness in his step. Thomas intercepted him in the hallway, abandoning subtlety for directness. "Doctor, a moment of your time. I believe we share a concern about someone in this house." The physician stopped, his face cycling through surprise, fear, and finally a kind of exhausted relief. "My study is through here," he said quietly, though Thomas knew he had no study at Thornfield Hall. They entered a small parlor overlooking the gardens, unused enough that dust motes danced in the afternoon light. "You've seen her," Ashford said. It wasn't a question. "In photographs. The camera captures what the eye might miss during long exposures. She moves through the drawing room when she thinks no one observes." The doctor sank into a chair that released the ghost of old pipe smoke. "Helena Blackwood. I've been treating her for 15 years, though treatment is perhaps too generous a term. I manage her condition, ensure her comfort, watch her fade like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Her condition? Melancholia, they called it initially. After her sister-in-law Catherine died in childbirth, Helena collapsed entirely. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't speak, wouldn't acknowledge her own name. Lord Blackwood, Edmund's father then, called me in. We tried everything known to medical science, such as it was in '48. Ashford opened his bag, revealing not the usual medical implements, but small bottles of laudanum, packets of Dover's powder, the pharmacy of the gently sedated. She recovered partially, enough to speak, to eat, but the melancholia transformed into something else. Mania, perhaps, or simply a different way of existing in the world. She became convinced Catherine was still alive, would hold conversations with empty air, set places at table for the dead. So they locked her away? The doctor's laugh contained no humor. Locked? No, Mr. Whitmore. Helena locks herself away. We've tried to integrate her back into the family, but she becomes distressed, violent even. She's comfortable in her routine, her room, her memories. The family provides everything she needs, ensures her comfort.
It's not ideal, but it's better than an asylum. Thomas thought of the footsteps he'd heard, 12 paces east, 12 west, the geography of voluntary imprisonment. Does she ever speak of wanting to leave? Leave? She doesn't acknowledge there's anywhere else to go. In her mind, it's still 1848. Victoria has just come to the throne, photography is a novelty, and her sister Catherine is about to give birth. She lives in a single year that repeats endlessly, like a daguerreotype that never fades. The revelation settled over Thomas like developer fluid, bringing clarity to what had been shadowy speculation. The family fears scandal. The family fears many things. Edmund's political career, Constance's marriage prospects, the general catastrophe of admitting mental illness in the bloodline. But yes, primarily scandal. A Mad Ant is a Victorian Gothic novel, not a modern political asset. That evening, Thomas returned to his improvised dark room with new understanding. The plates showing Helena weren't capturing a ghost, but documenting a prisoner, someone who existed in the margins of her own family's life. He developed each image with extra care, considering them now as historical documents, evidence of erasure. Sam helped in silence until he couldn't contain himself any longer. She's real then? The woman in the photographs? As real as we are, Sam. Perhaps more so, since she doesn't pretend to be anything other than what she is. They worked until midnight, creating a complete set of stereoscopic plates that excluded Helena entirely. The official record the Blackwoods required. But Thomas kept the others, the plates where she appeared like smoke given form. A woman caught between dimensions, not through photographic trickery, but through social invisibility. "What will you do?" Sam asked as they cleaned the equipment for what might be the last time at Thornfield. Thomas considered the question while wiping silver nitrate from his permanently stained fingers. "What can anyone do? She's not my family, not my responsibility. I'm a tradesman, hired to capture what they want seen, not what exists." Yet even as he spoke, he knew the words were partly false. Every photographer faced this choice, to document truth or manufacture comfort. Usually the decision was simple, governed by payment and professional survival. But Helena's image haunted him already, would continue haunting him, a reminder that some exposures lasted longer than any chemical process could explain. In his room that night, listening to her footsteps above, Thomas understood something fundamental about his craft. Photography pretended to be about light and chemistry, but it was really about time and choice, about what deserved preservation and what could be allowed to fade. Helena Blackwood existed in that space between, neither fully preserved nor completely erased, a living ghost in a house that had learned to look away. October 1st brought autumn proper to Thornfield Hall, leaves turning the color of old daguerreotypes, that particular sepia that spoke of time's passage. Thomas stood in the drawing room for what he knew would be his final session there, camera positioned for one last long exposure. He had told Lord Blackwood he needed to capture the morning light one more time, but truly, he was waiting for Helena. She came during the 7th minute, more visible now that he knew to look for her, moving along the edge of the frame like a memory trying to form. Through the camera's ground glass, he watched her approach the sealed door, place her palm against it, then turn toward the stereoscopic apparatus. For a moment, their eyes met across the mechanical distance, she in her eternal 1848, he in his temporary 1863, both understanding they were witnesses to each other's impossibility. Consider the strange democracy of madness, how it liberates even as it imprisons. Helena Blackwood had been freed from time's forward march, from the accumulation of griefs that drove others toward their own varied manias. Lord Blackwood's political ambitions, Lady Margaret's nervous propriety, Constance's fear of repetition, Reginald's colonial hardness. Weren't these their own forms of derangement, socially acceptable only because they synchronized with the world's larger insanity? Sam entered quietly, carrying fresh plates. "His lordship wants to speak with you, Mr. Whitmore, in his study."
Alone. The study had been rearranged since Thomas's first visit. The modern innovations pushed aside, the medieval manuscripts prominently displayed, as if Lord Blackwood had decided which version of himself to present. He stood with his back to the door, gazing out at his estate with the satisfaction of ownership that extended, perhaps, to the people within it. "You know," he said without preamble, "I know that photography captures more than we sometimes intend, my lord." Lord Blackwood turned, his political face replaced by something rawer, more honest. My Aunt Helena was brilliant once. Spoke 4 languages, played piano like an angel, understood mathematics better than my tutors. Then Catherine died, and Helena's mind fractured, like a photographic plate dropped on stone. He moved to his desk, unlocked a drawer, withdrew a leather purse that made the heavy sound of serious money. "Your fee, as agreed, plus a substantial addition for your discretion." "The plates showing anything unusual will be destroyed, of course." "Of course," Thomas agreed, though he had already secreted away the clearest image of Helena, hidden between 2 innocent landscapes. "She's well cared for," Lord Blackwood continued, needing perhaps to justify to someone, even a mere photographer. "Better than any asylum would manage. Dr. Ashford ensures her comfort. She wants for nothing." Thomas thought of pointing out that she wanted for freedom, for acknowledgement, for existence in her family's official history, but he recognized the futility. Lord Blackwood had constructed his own sealed doors, keeping out truths that might damage his carefully exposed life. "I understand completely, my lord. The commission is complete. The plates will be delivered as requested." Relief transformed Lord Blackwood's features, years falling away. "Capital. Mrs. Blackwood will be pleased. She worries, you understand, about Constance especially. The girl has too much of Helena's temperament, too much imagination." That afternoon, while Sam packed their equipment, Thomas found himself in the garden with Constance, who had sought him out with the determination of someone needing confession before the priest departed. "You've seen her, haven't you, Aunt Helena?" Thomas chose his words carefully. "I've seen many things through my camera, Miss Blackwood. Not all of them required discussion." She smiled sadly, older than her 23 years. "When I was small, before they sealed the door, she would read to me. Fairy tales mostly, about princesses locked in towers awaiting rescue. I didn't understand then that she was telling her own story. All stories are someone's truth, told slant. Will you tell this story, Mr. Whitmore, someday when it matters less to the living?" He thought of the hidden plate, Helena's image preserved in silver and secrets. "Photographs tell their own stories, Miss Blackwood. Sometimes they wait decades for the right viewer to understand them." She pressed something into his hand, a small cameo brooch, the kind aunts gave to nieces. "She wanted someone to have this. She told me through the door once, said to give it to the first kind stranger who noticed she was still there."
The October evening fell early as Thomas and Sam loaded their cart, the stereoscopic camera packed away like a closed eye. From an upper window a curtain moved, and Thomas saw her clearly for the first and last time without glass between them. Helena Blackwood, neither ghost nor fully living, trapped in the stereoscopic space between what was and what is, raised her hand in what might have been farewell or blessing. The house retreated into darkness as they drove away, leaving Thomas to wonder about the nature of visibility itself. How many Helena Blackwoods existed in how many sealed rooms, their stories overexposed into invisibility.
Photography promised to democratize memory, to preserve everyone equally. But he knew now this was its own kind of lie. The camera captured what it was allowed to capture, preserved what power permitted, left the rest to fade like unfixed images in sunlight. October 2nd dawned with unusual clarity, the kind of light that made every detail sharp enough to cut. Thomas found Lord Blackwood waiting in the breakfast room, no longer pretending casual encounter. The political mask had been set aside, replaced by the weary face of a man who had spent the night calculating costs and consequences. "I suspect, Whitmore, that we need to discuss terms beyond the merely financial." Thomas set down his teacup with careful precision, understanding that this was negotiation, not conversation. Around them, Thornfield Hall conducted its morning rituals, servants polishing silver that already gleamed, gardeners raking paths that showed no disorder, everyone maintaining appearances that fooled no one, but were essential nonetheless. "I'm a simple photographer, my lord. I complete commissions, deliver plates, maintain discretion. These are my only terms." Lord Blackwood's laugh contained equal parts relief and skepticism. "Nothing about you suggests simplicity, Mr. Whitmore. You see too much, understand too much. Men like you are dangerous to men like me. Only if we forget that we inhabit different worlds. You have Parliament. I have a studio in Canterbury. Our orbits need never intersect again. Watch how power negotiates with knowledge, each testing the other's boundaries, like photographers testing the limits of exposure." Lord Blackwood moved to the window, studying his grounds with the satisfaction of possession that extended to everything within view, perhaps even to the truths about them. The plates showing irregularities. "They'll be destroyed?" "All but one," Thomas said, surprising himself with the honesty. "I keep one as a reminder of what cameras can capture when given sufficient time. Call it a philosophical memento, if you will." His lordship's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. One plate. Not for publication, not for blackmail, but for philosophy. I suppose I can accept that. You're either very honest or very clever, Whitmore. In my experience, my lord, cleverness without honesty is just another form of exposure waiting to happen. The negotiation continued with British indirection, each man understanding what couldn't be said aloud. Helena would remain at Thornfield, but with improved circumstances. The sealed door would be unsealed, though discreetly. Dr. Ashford would continue his visits, but with actual treatment rather than mere containment. The family would acknowledge, privately, what they could never admit publicly. Constance found Thomas in the conservatory later, ostensibly admiring the orchids, but actually seeking confession, or absolution, perhaps both. "Father says you're leaving tomorrow. The commission is complete, Miss Blackwood."
She turned an orchid toward the light, studying its complex architecture. Did you know that some orchids can only be pollinated by a single species of insect? They evolve together, becoming so specialized that neither can exist without the other. Rather like secrets and families, don't you think? Or like stereoscopic images, Thomas suggested. Two views that only make sense when seen together. Will you judge us, Mr. Whitmore?
For what we've done? Thomas considered the question while watching dust motes dance in the greenhouse light, each one visible only because of its relationship to illumination. I'm a tradesman, Miss Blackwood, not a judge. But I might observe that every family has its sealed rooms, its members who exist outside the official narrative. The Blackwoods are neither unique in this nor especially cruel. You're simply documented. She smiled then, sad but genuine. Aunt Helena asked me to thank you. I don't know how she knew about the photographs, but she did. She said to tell you that being seen, even partially, even accidentally, was a gift she hadn't expected. That afternoon brought final portraits, the family arranged in compositions that suggested harmony without requiring it. Lord Blackwood stood behind his wife's chair, hands resting on its back rather than her shoulders. Reginald posed with a globe, already half departed to his colonial future. Constance held a book she wasn't reading, her thoughts clearly elsewhere, perhaps upstairs, where footsteps continued their measured pace. 8 minutes, Sam announced, beginning the exposure. 8 minutes of held breath and managed expressions, while somewhere above them, Helena Blackwood moved through her allowable space, no longer quite as invisible as before. The camera captured what it could. The surface tension of a family maintaining its necessary fictions. The quality of light that suggested autumn's arrival. The particular stillness that money could buy, but not make comfortable. When the exposure ended, Lord Blackwood handed Thomas an envelope, thick with banknotes and something else. A second document. A letter of recommendation, he explained, for when you seek more elevated clientele. Despite everything, your work is exceptional. Despite everything carried weight beyond its words, encompassing all they had not said, would never say, but both understood. Thomas accepted the envelope with a bow that managed to be both deferential and dignified, the gesture of a man who knew his worth even while acknowledging his station. Dr. Ashford appeared for a final consultation, though with Thomas rather than his patient. "You've done something remarkable here," the physician said quietly. "Not the photography, though that's fine enough, but you've made them see what they trained themselves to ignore. Helena will benefit from that seeing." Will she recover? Recovery suggests returning to a previous state. Helena will never be who she was in 1848. But she might become someone new, someone who exists in the present rather than the past. Sometimes that's the best medicine we can offer. Permission to be who we are now, rather than who we were then. October 10th in Canterbury brought the kind of rain that turned cobblestones into mirrors, each puddle reflecting the world inverted, as if the city existed simultaneously in 2 dimensions. Thomas stood in his studio, holding the single stereoscopic plate he had preserved from Thornfield Hall, watching how the light through his window made Helena Blackwood's captured image shimmer between presence and absence. Listen now to the ordinary sounds of his returned life. Sam in the front room, carefully adjusting the repaired Dallmeyer lens while humming a tune learned from the baker's daughter. The tick of his father's last functioning clock, marking time with mechanical indifference.
The street cries of vendors selling chestnuts and evening papers, each voice a thread in the fabric of the living world.
The commission money had solved immediate problems with the elegance of mathematics. Rent paid 3 months forward, enough coal ordered to see Dorothy through winter, new supplies of collodion and silver nitrate, even a modest sum set aside for the inevitable next crisis. Lord Blackwood's guilt had been generous, though Thomas wondered if any amount could truly purchase the forgetting that was asked of him. A letter had arrived that morning, Constance Blackwood's careful script on cream paper that smelled faintly of lavender. She wrote of household news, her engagement progressing toward a spring wedding, Reginald returning to India, her mother's nerves improving with the onset of autumn. Almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that the house has been quieter lately, more peaceful, as if certain disturbances have found their rest. Then, in a postscript that seemed deliberately casual, Father has decided to renovate the east wing. Aunt Helena will have a proper suite now, with windows facing the garden. Dr. Ashford says the light will do her good. Thomas set the letter aside, understanding its real message. His photographs had served their purpose, not the ones delivered to Lord Blackwood, but the ones that revealed what needed revealing. Sometimes the act of being seen was enough to change the conditions of invisibility. Sam entered with tea, his confidence with the equipment growing daily. Mrs. Morrison wants to know if we can photograph her daughters next week. She specifically requested the stereoscopic treatment. We're becoming fashionable, Thomas observed, though fashion in photography lasted about as long as collodion stayed stable. That's not all, Sam continued, barely containing excitement. Jenny's father, the baker, he wants to discuss terms. Terms? For courting proper, like. He says a photographer's apprentice might have prospects, especially one working with stereoscopy. The boy's joy radiated like a warming lamp, pure and uncomplicated. Thomas smiled, remembering his own young certainties before life developed them into more complex images. Tell him we'll discuss it over dinner, my treat. That evening brought Dorothy and her children to the studio, their monthly visit transformed by relative prosperity. The youngest, whose cough had worried Thomas, showed marked improvement, racing around the equipment with an energy that suggested coal fires and proper food had worked their mundane magic. Dorothy herself looked years younger, the constant calculation of poverty temporarily lifted from her features. You're different, she observed, while the children examined stereoscopic views of Canterbury Cathedral. The Thornfield Commission changed something. Thomas considered denying it, maintaining the protective distance he'd cultivated since their father's death. But Helena Blackwood's image watched from its hiding place, reminding him that invisibility was its own kind of prison. I photographed a ghost, he said simply. A living one. A woman erased from her own family's history, existing but not acknowledged, present but unseen. Dorothy studied him with the patience of an older sister who had witnessed his various philosophies over the years. And this ghost taught you something? That we all choose what to develop and what to leave in darkness. That kindness sometimes means preserving evidence of cruelty, so someone, someday, might understand what happened. She reached across to squeeze his hand, her fingers bearing the familiar stains of labor that no amount of washing could remove. You were always too thoughtful for your own good, Thomas. Father never understood that about you. Father understood clocks, mechanical movements, predictable patterns. People were too variable for his taste. Is that why you photograph them?
To make them hold still long enough to understand? The question lingered as the evening deepened, as the children tired and Dorothy gathered them for the journey home. After they left, Thomas returned to his dark room, that sanctuary of controlled light where time could be stopped, reversed, manipulated into meaning. He prepared a new plate with exceptional care, coating it with collodion mixed precisely as chemistry demanded. Then he positioned the hidden photograph of Helena Blackwood before his camera, creating a copy that would preserve her image beyond the fragility of a single plate. This wasn't about profit or artistic achievement, but about something more fundamental: the democracy of memory that photography had promised, but not yet delivered. As the exposure progressed, he thought about stereoscopy itself, that miracle of dual perspective that created depth from flatness. Wasn't this how memory worked as well? One eye seeing the past, the other the present, the mind synthesizing them into something that felt three-dimensional, felt true, even when it was only an illusion of convergence. The clock struck midnight as he finished, his father's mechanism still keeping faith with time despite neglect and age. Thomas held the new plate to the light, saw Helena's figure clearly preserved, a woman who existed now in silver and salt, in chemistry and conscience, in the space between what was documented and what was remembered. Tomorrow would bring new commissions, new faces to capture and stories to frame. But tonight, in the democratic darkness of his studio, Thomas Whitmore understood that photography's true gift wasn't the freezing of time, but the insistence that every moment, every person, every ghost deserved the dignity of being seen, of being preserved, of being remembered as more than shadow and light.